A forgotten veteran. A stranger's plea. One act of kindness sparks a storm of betrayal and hope. Can 5 words change a town? Stay to find out. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, stories that give chills. The sun hadn't quite risen over Mill Creek, a sleepy town where the air always smelled faintly of pine and motor oil. At 70, Frank moved slower than he used to, his knees creaking like the old wooden porch he stepped onto each morning. His faded green jacket, patched at the elbows, hung loose on his wiry frame. Grey hair peeked from under a worn baseball cap, and his blue eyes, though tired, still caught the world's details. A cracked sidewalk, a neighbour's crooked mailbox, the way the dawn painted the sky pink. He carried a toolbox, its handle smoothed by decades of use, and walked the half-mile to his garage on Maple Street. Mill Creek knew Frank as the guy who fixed things. Cars, lawnmowers, lives, if you let him. But they didn't know the scars beneath his flannel shirt, the ones from shrapnel in a desert war nobody talked about anymore, or the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m., his hands still gripping invisible rifles. 40 years ago, he'd been a soldier, one of the best, until the system he served spat him out, labeling him unfit after one too many questions about a botched mission. Betrayal stung worse than bullets, but Frank buried it, built a life here, and kept his medals in a cigar box under the bed. His garage was a sanctuary, its walls lined with tools older than most of the town's kids. The air smelled of grease and steel, and a battered radio played Johnny Cashlow. Frank was under a '67 Chevy, wrench in hand, when the bell above the door jingled. He slid out, expecting a neighbour with a flat tire. Instead, a frail woman stood there, maybe 80, her white hair pulled into a bun, her blue cardigan threadbare at the cuffs. She clutched a faded photograph, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. "Sir," she said, voice thin but steady, "I heard you fix things. Can you help me?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag, noticing her eyes, red-rimmed, like she'd been crying. "What's broken, ma'am?" he asked, keeping his tone soft, the way he did with spooked recruits back in the day. She hesitated, then held out the photograph. It was old, creased, showing a young man in a uniform grinning under a palm tree. "Not a thing," she said. "It's me. I need to find him." Frank's gut twisted. He knew that look. Grief, hope, desperation, all tangled up. He could have said no, sent her to the police, but something in her eyes stopped him. "Let's sit," he said, pulling a stool from the corner. The garage smelled of coffee now, brewing on a hot plate. He poured her a cup, set it on a crate, and listened. Her name was Clara, though she didn't say it until the coffee was half gone. She didn't say much else either. Just that the man in the photo was her son, lost to her years ago after a war that broke him. "He came back different," she whispered, fingers tracing the photo's edge. "The VA said he was fine, but he wasn't. He left, and I don't know where." Frank nodded, his own memories stirring. Friends who'd come home hollow, promises the system never kept. He didn't push her for details, didn't need to. Her pain was a language he spoke fluently. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but I'll ask around. Got a name?" She scribbled it on a napkin. Thomas Reed, born 1955. Frank tucked it into his pocket next to a worn dog tag he never left behind. Clara's shoulders eased, just a fraction, and she murmured, "Thank you." He walked her to the door, the bell jingling as she stepped into the morning light. It was a small thing, a promise to try, but it felt like lifting a tank off his chest. Back under the Chevy, Frank's hands moved on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd seen too many Claras, too many families chewed up by wars and bureaucracy. The VA's betrayal still burned, forms lost, claims denied, veterans left to rot. He'd fought it once, filed complaints, even got a congressman's ear, but the system was a brick wall. So he fixed what he could. Carburetors, bikes, the occasional broken spirit. By noon, the garage was busy. Old man Jenkins dropped off a lawnmower, griping about gas prices. A kid named Mikey, 16 and too shy to look Frank in the eye, lingered, watching him work. Frank tossed him a wrench. "Hold this," we said, and Mikey's face lit up like he'd been handed a medal. The town didn't know Frank's past, but they knew his hands, steady, patient, always building something from nothing. Outside, Maple Street hummed with life. Kids on bikes, a delivery truck's rumble, the faint scent of fresh bread from the bakery. Frank didn't see Clara again that day, but her napkin stayed in his pocket, a quiet weight. He didn't know it yet, but that promise, that small act of kindness, was about to unravel everything. The next morning, Frank found Clara waiting outside his garage, her blue cardigan buttoned against the early chill. She held a small paper bag, the kind you'd get from the bakery down the street. "Thought you might like these," she said, offering it with a shy smile. Inside were 2 blueberry muffins, still warm, the scent sweet and comforting. Frank's throat tightened. He hadn't had anyone bring him breakfast in years. "Thanks, Clara," he said, setting the bag on a workbench. He didn't ask why she'd come back. Didn't need to. Her eyes, less red today but still heavy with worry, told him she was checking if he'd kept his promise. He pulled the napkin from his pocket, Thomas Reed's name smudged but legible. "Made a few calls yesterday," he said, leaning against a toolbox. "Old army buddy at the VA owes me a favor. He's digging through records." Clara's hands stilled, clutching her photograph like a lifeline. "You didn't have to," she whispered, but her voice carried gratitude thicker than the morning fog. Frank shrugged, the way he did when someone thanked him for an oil change. "Sit if you want. Coffee's on." She did, perching on the same stool, and they talked, not about Thomas, but about small things. The way Mill Creek's river smelled of moss after rain. How the bakery's bread wasn't as good as it used to be. Her stories were quiet, her voice gaining strength with each sip of coffee. Frank listened, his hands idle for once, the garage's hum of tools replaced by her words. He noticed her worn shoes, the way her cardigan's hem frayed, and wondered how long she'd been alone. He didn't ask. Some wounds you let people keep private. By the 3rd day, Clara's visits were part of Frank's routine. She'd arrive just after dawn, always with something. A muffin, a thermos of tea, once a single daisy plucked from a neighbour's yard. Frank kept asking questions, piecing together Thomas's story without pressing too hard. "A good soldier," she said, until the war chewed him up. "Discharged in 76, drifted after that. The VA called him stable." But Clara saw the truth. Her boy was lost, not just to her, but to himself. Frank nodded, his own memories of broken men flashing like warning lights. He'd started carrying a notebook, jotting names of shelters, clinics, anyone who might know a Thomas Reed. At night, he made calls from his porch, the air sharp with pine, his voice low to keep neighbours from eavesdropping. Clara never asked how much time he spent, but her eyes softened each morning, like she saw the weight he carried for her. One afternoon, Mikey, the shy kid from the garage, watched Clara leave and asked, "She your grandma?" Frank chuckled, the sound rusty. "Nah, just someone who needs help." Mikey nodded, like he understood, and went back to polishing a wrench. Frank didn't know it, but that moment planted a seed, one that would grow louder than he expected. Mill Creek's streets carried whispers faster than the river carried leaves. By the end of the week, neighbours noticed Clara's visits. Old man Jenkins, dropping off his mower again, raised an eyebrow. "Got yourself a girlfriend, Frank?" he teased, but his tone held a edge of curiosity. Mrs. Larson, who ran the bakery, saw Clara's daisy and smiled. "That's sweet," she said, but added, "Hope she's not trouble. Others weren't so kind." At the diner, Frank overheard 2 men in flannel, their coffee cups steaming. "Old guy's playing hero," one muttered. "Probably scamming her for cash," said the other. Frank kept his head down, but the words stung like shrapnel. He'd seen this before. People loved a good deed until it made them question their own inaction. By Sunday, the whispers grew sharper. A woman at the VFW, where Frank volunteered, pulled him aside. "Folks say she's using you," she said, her voice low. "You don't even know her story." Frank's jaw tightened, but he only said, "Folks say a lot." He walked away, the cigar box of medals heavy in his mind, a reminder of when trust cost him everything. The town's mixed reactions, some warm, some cold, felt like a mirror of his past, when the army praised his courage but punished his questions. Betrayal didn't always come with a knife. Sometimes it was just a whisper over coffee. Then came the test. On Monday, a sleek black car pulled up to the garage, its engine purring like trouble. A man in a suit stepped out, mid-40s, hair slicked back, his smile too polished. "Mr. Thompson?" he said, extending a hand Frank didn't take. "Name's Carver. Town council. We need to talk about your visitor." Frank wiped grease from his fingers, his eyes narrowing. "What about her?" Carver's smile didn't waver, but his tone sharpened. "Clara Reed. Word is she's been here daily. Some folks are concerned. She's not exactly stable, you know." Frank's stomach knotted, but his face stayed stone. "She's a customer, that's all." Carver leaned closer, his cologne sharp. "Let's be real. You're not a detective. You're a mechanic. Stick to what you know. Or there could be issues. Licensing, permits. You get me? Frank's hands clenched, the old soldier in him itching to push back. He'd faced worse threats, desert ambushes, brass who buried his reports. But this was different. This was his home, his sanctuary, and Clara was counting on him. He took a breath, the air thick with oil and tension. I hear you, he said, voice low. But I'm helping her. That's not changing. Carver's smile faded, his eyes cold. You call, Thompson? Don't say I didn't warn you. He left, the car's tires crunching gravel, but the threat lingered like exhaust. Frank stood there, the garage's hum suddenly too loud, and wondered if he'd just lit a fuse. That night, the conflict grew teeth. Frank was locking up when Mikey ran up, out of breath, his red hoodie damp with sweat. Mr. Frank, you gotta see this, he said, holding out his phone. A post on the town's online forum, anonymous but vicious. Frank Thompson's running a con with some old lady. Taking her money, playing hero. Shut it down. Comments piled up, some defended him, but most didn't. He's always been weird, keeping to himself. Bet he's hiding something. Frank's chest tightened, the words echoing the Army's dismissal years ago. Unfit, unreliable. He handed the phone back, his voice steady despite the storm inside. People talk, Mikey. Always will. But as he walked home, the air sharp with pine, doubt crept in. Was he helping Clara or just chasing ghosts? The napkin in his pocket felt heavier. Thomas Reed's name a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. At the diner the next morning, Mrs. Larson avoided his eyes when she poured his coffee. Jenkins didn't wave from his porch. Even Mikey seemed quieter, his wrench moving slower. The town's whispers had turned to a roar, and Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him. Clara's muffin sat untouched on the workbench, its sweetness soured by betrayal. Not hers, but the town's. He didn't know it yet, but the worst was coming, and it would test every ounce of his resolve. The garage felt emptier that Tuesday, the air thick with the tang of oil and something heavier, doubt. Frank tightened a bolt on a Ford's engine, his hand steady but his mind churning. Clara hadn't shown up at dawn, breaking her routine for the first time in a week. Her muffin from yesterday sat stale on the workbench, a quiet accusation. He'd called the number she'd given him, but it rang unanswered, the silence louder than the radio's hum. Had she given up? Had he failed her? The napkin with Thomas Reed's name lay crumpled beside his tools, its ink fading like hope. Frank's chest ached. Not from age, but from the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He'd been here before, decades ago when the Army buried his reports, when friends vanished into addiction or worse. The system betrayed them, and now Mill Creek seemed to be doing the same to him. He worked through the morning, the clank of metal his only companion, but his eyes kept drifting to the door. No jingle, no Clara. By noon, the ache had turned to dread, and Frank felt the walls closing in. He closed the garage early, something he hadn't done in years, and walked to Clara's address, a rundown apartment on Elm Street, its paint peeling like old scars. The air smelled of damp leaves and neglect. The street quiet, except for a dog barking in the distance. He knocked, the door's wood rough under his knuckles. No answer. He knocked again, louder, his heart thudding like it had in combat. Clara, it's Frank. Silence. A neighbor, an older man in a flannel shirt, peered out from next door. She left last night, he said, voice gruff. Saw her with a suitcase, headed to the bus stop. Didn't say where. Frank's stomach dropped, the world tilting. Why didn't you stop her? He asked, sharper than he meant. The man shrugged. Not my business. Frank stood there, the suitcase's image burning in his mind. Clara, alone, her photograph clutched tight. Had she lost faith in him? Had the town's whispers driven her away? He walked back to Maple Street, the dusk sky bruising purple, his boots heavy on the cracked sidewalk. The garage's neon sign flickered, its buzz a mocking echo of his failure. Inside, he sank onto a stool, his hands shaking now, the soldier's calm crumbling. I tried, Clara, he whispered, voice cracking. The words felt hollow, like prayers to a God who'd stopped listening. The next morning, the town's judgment hit like a storm. Frank opened the garage to find a crowd outside. Neighbors, some familiar, some not. Their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. Mrs. Larson stood at the front, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes cold. Frank, we need to talk, she said, her voice carrying over the murmur. He stepped outside, the air sharp with frost, his green jacket too thin for the chill. About what? He asked, though he already knew. A man in a trucker hat stepped forward, holding a phone. This, he said, shoving the screen in Frank's face. Another forum post, this one worse. Frank Thompson ran that old lady out of town. Took her money, broke her heart. He's no hero. The comments were vicious. Con artist, liar, should be locked up. Frank's blood ran cold, the words slicing deeper than any shrapnel. That's not true, he said, his voice low but firm. I was helping her. Mrs. Larson crossed her arms. Then where is she, Frank? Why'd she leave? He had no answer, and the silence damned him. Someone in the back shouted, You're a disgrace! The word hit like a bullet. Disgrace, the same label the army pinned on him when he dared question their lies. Mikey, lingering at the edge, looked away, his red hoodie a blur as he turned. Even the kid doubted him now. Frank's fists clenched, his nails biting into his palms. Believe what you want, he said, turning back to the garage. The door slammed behind him, the jingle a funeral bell. Inside, Frank stood alone, the garage's shadows swallowing him. The radio played low, some song about lost love, but he barely heard it. His eyes fell on the cigar box, tucked on a shelf beside a rusty wrench. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't wanted to face the memories. But now, with Clara gone and the town against him, he needed something to hold on to. He lifted the lid, the hinge creaking like his knees. Inside were his medals, bronze, silver, a purple heart, their ribbons faded but intact. Beneath them, a photograph, creased and yellowed. Frank, 25, grinning with his squad in a desert camp. Their faces were young, unbroken, before the war, and the system chewed them up. He traced a finger over one face. Jimmy, his best friend, who never came home. Jimmy had believed in him, even when the brass didn't. You keep going, Frank, he'd said once, his voice clear in Frank's memory. You don't quit no matter what they throw at you. Frank's eyes stung, the air thick with dust and regret. He'd kept going then, through ambushes, through betrayal. But now, Clara's absence felt like a wound he couldn't stitch. The town's condemnation was a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He closed the box, but kept the photo in his hand, its edges soft from time. I'm not done yet, he said to the empty garage, his voice steadying. He didn't know how, but he'd find Clara, or at least find out what happened to Thomas. Not for the town, not for himself, but for her, and for the part of him that still believed in promises. Outside, the crowd had dispersed, but their words lingered, sharp as broken glass. Frank slipped the photo into his pocket next to Clara's napkin and started planning his next move. Frank didn't sleep that night. The porch creaked under his weight as he sat, the air sharp with pine and the faint hum of crickets. Clara's napkin and the old squad photo lay on the table beside a cold coffee mug. He'd spent hours calling shelters, veterans groups, even a retired colonel who owed him a favor. Nothing. Thomas Reed was a ghost, and Clara was gone. But at dawn, as the sky bled pink, a beat-up sedan pulled up, its engine coughing. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, her brown hair streaked with grey, her coat too thin for the chill. She carried a manila envelope, her steps hesitant but deliberate. Mr. Thompson? She asked, voice soft but steady. Frank stood, his green jacket rumpled, his eyes wary. Who's asking? She offered a small smile, tinged with sadness. I'm Ellen Reed, Clara's daughter-in-law. She told me about you. Frank's heart stuttered, the napkin's weight heavy in his pocket. Where is she? He asked, sharper than he meant. Ellen's smile faded. She's in a hospital in Raleigh. Heart trouble. She left Mill Creek to find Thomas one last time. Frank's knees buckled, but he caught himself on the railing. She's stable, Ellen said quickly. But she wanted you to have this. She handed him the envelope, its edges worn like Clara's photograph. Inside was a letter, Clara's handwriting shaky but clear, and a dog tag. Thomas Reed's, its metal dulled by time. Frank's hands trembled as he read. Frank, you gave me hope when I had none. Thomas is gone, died 10 years ago, homeless, forgotten. I didn't want to believe it, but I found his records. Your kindness kept me going. Don't let them break you. Clara. The dog tag gleamed faintly, a soldier's name etched forever. Frank's eyes stung, the betrayal of the system. Thomas's death, Clara's pain, cutting deeper than the town's lies. Ellen spoke again, her voice low. She said you were the only one who cared enough to try. Frank nodded, unable to speak. The letter a lifeline in a storm he thought he'd lost. By noon, Frank was back at the garage, the letter taped to the workbench beside Clara's stale muffin. He worked in silence, the radio off, But the bell jingled mid-afternoon. Mikey burst in, his red hoodie bright against the garage's shadows, his phone shaking in his hand. "Mr. Frank, you gotta see this!" It was a video posted on the town's forum, shaky but clear. Clara, in a hospital bed, her white hair loose, her voice weak but fierce. "Frank Thompson didn't scam me," she said, eyes blazing. "He gave me a reason to keep going. You judged him without knowing. Shame on you." The video spread like wildfire, comments flipping from venom to guilt. "We were wrong. He's a good man." Mrs. Larson was next through the door, her apron twisted in her hands. "Frank, I'm sorry," she whispered, tears brimming. "I believed the lies." Jenkins followed, then others, their apologies piling up like offerings. Frank listened, his face unreadable, but his voice was steady. Clara deserved better. So did her son. That evening, the man in the trucker hat from the crowd showed up, head bowed. "I started that post," he admitted, voice cracking. "Carver paid me to stir trouble. I didn't know." Frank's jaw tightened, the councilman's threat echoing. "Where's Carver now?" The man shrugged, shame heavy on his shoulders. "Folks are calling for his resignation." Frank nodded, the air thick with oil and redemption. The town's judgment had crumbled, and Clara's words had lit the fuse. He felt no triumph, only relief, and a quiet pride that he'd kept his promise. Mill Creek changed after that. The forum post vanished, replaced by a fundraiser for Clara's medical bills, organised by Mikey's mom. It raised enough in a week to cover her care and bring her back to town. When she returned, Frank was there, helping her down the bus steps, her photograph still in her hands. The garage became a hub, not just for repairs, but for stories. Veterans sharing their scars, neighbours listening instead of judging. Mrs. Larson started a weekly coffee morning, inviting folks to talk about their struggles, no questions barred. Even Jenkins, gruff as ever, donated his old mower to a vet in need. Frank didn't lead the charge. He didn't need to. His quiet stand had sparked something, a ripple that grew into a wave. The VFW hung a plaque, not for Frank but for Thomas Reed, a soldier lost to the system. Clara cried when she saw it, her hand in Frank's, the dog tag now on a chain around her neck. The town learned to ask questions before assuming, to see the person behind the story. Carver resigned quietly, his sleek car gone from Maple Street. Mill Creek wasn't perfect, but it was trying, and that was enough. Frank's kindness left a mark deeper than he'd ever know. Clara lived out her days in a small house near the river, her porch always open to visitors. She told anyone who'd listen about Frank, the man who didn't give up. Mikey, inspired, started a high school club for kids to fix bikes for veterans, his shy smile bolder now. Frank kept fixing cars, but he added something new. Teaching vets to rebuild engines, showing them their hands could still build something whole. He never opened the cigar box again, didn't need to. The squad photo stayed in his pocket, a reminder of Jimmy's words. Keep going. Clara's letter joined it, her words a new medal he carried silently. The garage's neon sign glowed brighter, its buzz a beacon for those who needed it. One evening, a young vet, fresh from service, walked in, his eyes hollow like Thomas's must have been. Frank handed him a wrench, no questions asked, and said, "Start here." The kid nodded, and Frank knew the cycle might break, one small act at a time. Kindness wasn't loud, but it was stronger than any war, any betrayal. It built things that lasted. The sun set over Mill Creek, painting the garage in gold. Frank stood outside, his green jacket patched but warm, his toolbox at his side. The river murmured, carrying the scent of moss and memory. He looked at the horizon, where Clara's house glowed faintly, and felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. Some heroes don't need medals or shouts. They just need a promise, kept against all odds. Write in the comments what moved you most. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. These stories can't be missed.